Question for you, when is it okay to take on tech debt? Welcome to Scout++. In this video, we're going to discuss that in the context of building the star voting app. We're going to look at some of the features I was able to get done over this last week, moving the email confirmation into the job queue, caching the election results, as well as actually verifying JWT tokens. I know the T stands for tokens, but I'm going to make that mistake a lot over the rest of the video. So we'll get to all that right after the intro. All right, so one of the first things I did is set up the email receipt for when the user is casting a ballot, and I hooked that into the new cast vote controller that is using the job queue that we set up in the previous video. Just a recap on that. The cast vote controller, this is an express handler that takes a request object. Right now it does some logic to check that the user is able to vote, and then it pushes an event into the queue with the request ID, the ballot that the user is submitting, as well as the voter roll. Then we have a handle the cast vote event, which picks that up from the queue, saves the ballot to the database as well as the roll. Right now in the request handler is where that email is being sent, but we want to move it down into the event handler. Now, theoretically, it would just be a simple thing to cut and paste it there, right? But we see that there's a lot of data that we were using from the initial request handler that we no longer have in the event handler. And this was actually an interesting case of figuring out what data we need to pass through the event. Here's the definition of the event here. What data we need to pass into the event for us to be able to send this email. So a quick run through of what's missing. Obviously the user's email address is necessary. It was also using the request object itself in order to determine the URL. The URL was a parameter of this receipt function. This receipt function just generates the details of the email that we're going to send, the subject, the body, etc. It also requires the target election. I believe it just uses the ID for that, and as well as the email and the ballot that the user is casting. Now, some of this is easy, right? The ballot we actually have, we just need to call it correctly, but we're missing the email, the request object, and the election. The request object is kind of a no-go because the entire event needs to be serialized and deserialized, right? And that is not something that we can do with the request object. But very likely, since we're just using the request object to generate the URL, we could theoretically stick the URL into the event. So here are the kind of pieces we need to get. We need to get the URL, we need to get the target election, and we need to get the email. Maybe pause for a moment, think about what data you might put into the event itself. And then in 3 seconds, we'll roll on with the solution I came with. So I actually ended up only putting in the user email into the event. But then let's look at how I got that other data. So for the target election, I actually opted to go ahead and make another database request and re-pull down that target election. My thought being the entire event is going to be stored in the database and then read back from the database. So if we're storing all the data for the election in the event, it's not going to be any faster, right? That's more data that we need to both save and then read back out. So I don't think the extra hit of doing this extra lookup inside the event handler is going to be that much different than trying to serialize the entire election and store that in the event. Then for the URL, I noticed that the URL was effectively constant, right? And so there wasn't really any reason that we needed to be constantly regenerating that URL. So I just created this global data service that we'll use to store some constants, in this case the main URL, and so then we'll generate the URL that way. There was another option which I was heavily considering, which was to refactor this receipt method to, instead of taking in the entire election just to request the election title and the election ID, because that's really the only thing it needs. And that would be a lot less data that we would need to store into the event, just the election title and ID, rather than the entire data of the election. Unfortunately, that would mean refactoring a lot of places and tests that are also using this method. So for now, I opted, again, just to get the feature working. So re-grabbing the target election from the database. And if we need to in the future optimize that further, we can. But I don't want to spend too much time over-optimizing for something like one database read. So now we finally have the full story of setting up that event queue. The whole point of it, again, was because when the user casts this vote, we have these 3 side effects, and we want to make sure that we either take care of them all or we don't do any of them, right? We need to save the ballot, save the role in a different database table, and send a confirmation email. We can't be in a situation where we maybe save the email and then the server dies and we don't actually save the ballot. So we put these all into the job queue. The job queue will attempt to do all these, and even if the server dies in the middle, that job is persisted, and so it will pick up again whenever the server starts, and it will again save the ballot, save the role, send the email. Right now, the only problem is that the email is not idempotent, meaning that there's a potential that a user would get a second confirmation receipt, but we'd rather have a second receipt than no receipt, right? So that is that, and now let's move on to the next item. So the next thing I worked on was caching the election results. Previously, the get election results, it would retabulate the entire election every time this endpoint was hit. Obviously, that's not great. So we set up a system so it's only going to recalculate the election results once every 5 minutes in this case. Theoretically, later we could add some more logic, for example, to check if any new votes have been cast or something like that. For this, we basically just stored the election results in memory, right? So we're not persisting them. So if the server dies and restarts, we will need to recalculate it. But since that's only going to be once, in this case in every 5 minutes, it's not a problem. So here we just set up a map with the cached results. Every time we're requesting the results, we check if the data already exists. If so, it has an expiry time. And if we're still within the expiry time, we return those results. Otherwise, we recalculate the results, store those, and then send them back as the response. One thing here that really tripped me up is, obviously here I've called it expire time as milliseconds, right? It's important to understand from the variable like what these values mean, right? Ideally, I wanted to do something like this, where we actually have a type of milliseconds, which in this case is just an alias for a number. And so this is fine, we can do this. But because of the way that TypeScript and VS Code work, even if I've typed this expiry time as milliseconds, when I hover over the variable, the IntelliSense simplifies this to a number, which is not what I want. I've actually found there's an open feature request to TypeScript itself to fix this issue. And I looked into a few possible solutions. One was to type this with a brand. And so if you do this, you can see here that IntelliSense does tell you it is milliseconds. However, even though this is typed as milliseconds and it is just a branded number, we still can't just set the value without specifically casting it. And in my opinion, that's not any better than having it show up as a number, right? I'd rather just add the as milliseconds to the variable name. Another option, theoretically, cast it as a number or a number, which is a specific TypeScript interface. And theoretically, this works, right? Here IntelliSense tells me it is milliseconds and I don't need to cast it. However, I can't do addition. And so this doesn't work. So here are two options that kind of almost solve the issue, but not quite. So hopefully Microsoft, somebody fix this thing. For now, I'm keeping the variable name as milliseconds so that everybody knows what's going on. We talked more about the specific logic of like ideally when do we want to cache this or not. We do need to consider that theoretically, we need to invalidate the results anytime a vote is cast or anytime a vote is invalidated, right? So we have the feature of election officials going through and saying, hey, actually, this person is not actually registered to vote, so we can't count their ballot. And so then we would need to prune that from any cached results. We're also talking about ways to make this precinct summable, meaning that you could have two different groups that are part of the same election, maybe they're different counties or whatever, and they can add their own results using star voting, and then we can combine those two sets of results. And so that might be a way to kind of store a running result of the election as new votes come in. But that's not something we've really figured out how exactly we want to handle that. So for now, this is this isn't the good enough category. The results may be at most 5 minutes stale, and there's the potential, especially after a election is over and it is not being updated anymore, that we're doing a lot more tabulation than we would actually need to. But I think we're going to have a better insight into what we want this feature to actually do and how it should behave once we're live. So for now, this is good enough, and let's focus on rolling this out so we can start getting user feedback before trying to like optimize all these features too much. So finally, the last thing I got to this week was to actually verify the JWT tokens so that we can check that the user is who they say they are. Previously, we have just been, I guess, overly trusting when a user passes in a JWT token. So here in the account service, I added this function to extract the user from the request that actually uses the JWT library to do the verify, passing in our private key. The private key comes from the environment file when the server starts up. I also built out a mock account service for this function. And so here, because we had a lot of tests that were failing because they weren't passing in any valid tokens, and we need to go back and we need to fix those, but I wanted to get this feature out. So here for the mock account service, there's an option of whether or not we want to do the verification, and by default it is false, and so we just don't verify, which is kind of like what was happening already. But we can toggle this to true, and then we can set the private key, which is different to whatever might be in an environment file. We can set it to whatever we want. So then I added an account service test, basically testing both the positive and negative case, that when a user in this case tests that they try to create an election, and we use a user with a good token, so I actually sign it with the account service's own private key that I have access to, and we expect that to succeed. And then for a different user, I create, or rather I sign their token with a different private key, and I assert that that fails. So we know this is working, and then we'll put on our backlog to refactor some of the previous tests that weren't using proper users, or at least not users that had a signed token. I know we will need to go and refactor all of those tests that relied on not having a valid signature, but now is not the time for that. And it's important to understand when it's time to iterate quickly and allow yourself to take on tech debt, and when it's time to prioritize removing that tech debt and focusing on system stability. Recently, after I pushed this change, we started talking about a new feature allowing a Discord bot to connect to the service and use this as its backend, and it would allow users in Discord to use star voting. That's going to require another refactor of the account service. And if I had spent the time to go back and refactor all the tests that weren't using a valid signature, by the time we update this new feature, I might have needed to go and refactor them again, right? So it's important to understand when is the time to iterate. Be aware of the tech debt that you're taking on, but sometimes that's the right decision to make. Anyway, enough of that speech. That was all I was able to get done this week. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to just share our progress with you guys, helping keep me accountable. So, hope you like these videos. If you do want to join us and build the future of democracy for America, get in contact. We have plenty of work that needs to be done. We could absolutely use your talents. So I'm gonna get back to work. I'll see you in the next video.